Good morning, everybody. Okay, so, yes, Rosh Chodesh Tov. Okay. So after today, the next class that we have is on the 14th of April, so just over a month from now. We have a few more I can tell you. So Arendt, let's see, I can do it fast this way, so I get the list of classes. We have April 14th, and then so one in April, we have one in May, and two in June. So what I think we might do is we're going to start talking about origins of totalitarianism. Maybe we're not going to obviously cover everything that Hannah Arendt ever wrote about. My thought, there are three parts of origins of totalitarianism. So I thought we can do part one today, part two on the 14th, and part three on May 5th, and that'll give us two classes then in June to talk about Eichmann in Jerusalem in June. So that means if you want to read Eichmann in Jerusalem, you have until June 9th to read it. Or you can read the excerpts that are in this book. And in terms of origins of totalitarianism, which is besides Eichmann, is her most famous book, and it should be as controversial. It's just not, because most people didn't bother to read it because it's very long. But it's what made her name, right? I mean, this was the book that put her on the map in the academic world and as a serious thinker. But it also what makes her such a unique person, because it's a combination of political theory and history, but not pure theory, but not pure history. So it doesn't fall into a box. Which she never felt into a box, and she, was such a complicated and sophisticated thinker. The claims that she makes in this book all follow through in Eichmann in Jerusalem. So anyone who read her carefully shouldn't have been surprised by what she said in Eichmann in Jerusalem. So I thought we could take time going through this over this class and the next two over the three parts. Originally, it was even published in 3 volumes. This is usually it's combined in one by Origins of Totalitarianism. Now, if you're reading the excerpts, they give you an excerpt from each. Now, in part 2, Stateless Persons, the part that says the perplexities of the rights of man, that's from later. That's from part 2 of Origins of Totalitarianism. But then in the totalitarianism part, the Jews and society is an excerpt from part 1. Expansion is an excerpt from part 2, and total domination is an excerpt from part 3. So if you're reading just the excerpts and you read the perplexities in 31, but then from 75 through 145, you could just read each of those. If you remember today, the one that says expansion is what we'll do the next class. Total domination is then the third one. I'm going to read you passages and talk about the whole, section. Each volume is about 100 pages, but if not, that'll give you enough of a taste, and then I'll share the rest, so you'll kind of get the credit for as if you read all of this, sort of, because you get the editor of the portable volume kind of picked the best chapter that he thought, in each of those 3 volumes. So, Origins of Totalitarianism came out in 1951, and then she reissued it in, part of it in 1948, then 1951, she reissued it in 66, she reissued it again in 68, reissued it again in 1976, then 1979, making little adjustments, writing new prefaces to it. I mean, she kept turning back to it because it was her main sort of presentation of basically what's wrong in the world, and how the world came to the catastrophe that it did with the Holocaust, and also with the Stalinist terror in the Soviet Union. So what's the thing that's the part that's most remembered from her theory of totalitarianism, that she takes Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia, and she kind of sees a parallel there, right? And that both are totalitarian societies. That's why she's remembered sort of as a theorist of a Cold War theorist from the Western perspective, is that she lumps, by using the term totalitarianism, it puts Stalinist Soviet Union, Stalinist Russia, and Nazi Germany in the same category. Whereas nobody writing in the eastern side of the Iron Curtain would ever say that, right? Because communism and Nazism, they use the term fascism, which they would never lump those in the same category. But Hannah Arendt is trying to go beyond those ideological distinctions and looking more at the structure of society, and what she sees that the horrifying endpoint of the development from sort of, from the 19th century up to, the 1940s, she sees that as the culmination, and this is where she doesn't quite equate Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany. What she sees as the bottommost point is the concentration camps and the death camps. That when people are to the point where people are dehumanized, that's the bottom point of civilization. So the question is, how does, it's sort of a reverse of the Hegelian perspective of history that she was trained in Germany, where history continues to progress to get better and better. She sees it as the opposite, that it's getting worse and worse until it gets to the bottommost point. Of course, she is a survivor. She's a refugee from Nazi Germany, so her perspective of history is very different than someone like Hegel, who lived 100 years before, right, and obviously did not experience that. So I don't want to criticize Hegel, because I would think he would revise his theory if he saw what happened with the rise of the Nazis as well. So the 3 volumes of Origins of Totalitarianism, the first one is called Anti-Semitism, and the second one is called Imperialism, and the third part is called Totalitarianism. So anti-Semitism, imperialism, and totalitarianism. And that's very important for us to appreciate as Jews, right? In that she sees and that's why, again, it shows that she's telling the story of how the Holocaust happened. She includes Stalinist Russia in the story to show that these are general patterns, that it's not specifically about the Jews. But the part that she focuses on is what happens to the Jewish people in the areas controlled by the Nazis, right, through the Second World War. So that's, obviously, millions of people were killed under Stalin as well. She includes that in it. Her analysis, as I mentioned, I think at the first class, her analysis of the Soviet story is not as sharp as the German story, because she doesn't read Russian, number one. Number two, she didn't have very limited access to the sources. So even if she did read Russian, she didn't know the whole story. Historians in general have only been able to really tell the story of the Soviet Union after 1991, when the Soviet Union falls and then the archives are opened up and you're able to read the records of the internal discussions of the Communist Party, right? That wasn't available to scholars when the Soviet Union was still a regime. So nobody really had access to the full sources of what was going on, now of course her access was limited, writing in the late 40s and 50s or Nazi Germany as well, but in terms of the story, right, of the rise of anti-Semitism, imperialism, she had access to that. She's not just writing about Germany, she's writing about Europe, America in general as well, and we'll go through some of those points. Now, one thing in terms of the title, that it's a very difficult book to summarize. It's a very complex argument, and it doesn't really have a good title, right? And she often says it's really not about the origins of totalitarianism, it's about totalitarianism. And one of the points that she always tries to make is that it's not inevitable, right? And that it's not just because it's where history developed to doesn't mean it's the culmination of where history has to go. And that's a very important point for her. So the point is that history is ultimately in our hands, which goes back to her general political theory that we have to take action. It's why Zionism was important to her, that we talked about last week. Just in terms of other titles that she used, there were other titles that she thought of. One was The Elements of Shame. That was her original title for it. The Elements of Shame, Anti-Semitism, Imperialism, Racism. And then racism got changed to totalitarianism, and elements of shame got changed to origins of totalitarianism. And it's important I want to point that out because it's not, just to understand it as a theory of totalitarianism that is lumping fascism with communism, that wasn't her real goal, right? Her real goal was to show how history and society devolved to the point where people could be dehumanized as people. And that's what and that's what that's what she's trying to understand. Another title was The Three Pillars of Hell, right? The three elements. And Three Pillars of Hell. Another one is A History of Totalitarianism, which she also thought was better than Origins, because she's not focused on necessarily how it began, but how it developed, is what she writes about. The title, so Origins of Totalitarianism is the American title. Very often books will have different titles in different languages and even in different English-speaking countries. So in the UK, the title was The Burden of Our Time. She did not like that title, but that's what the British publisher wanted to use. It's very often titles get changed by the publisher. My dissertation, which was on Jews in the German army in the First World War, the title that I used at the Graduate Center at CUNY was Jewish at the Front, which I thought was a great title. But then my publisher, which is a German publisher, but it published in English, they said, no, you can't use that title. It's a boring title. So the published title is Jewish Integration in the German Army in the First World War. It's very boring. But the publisher says you have to use it doesn't matter that it's boring, it has to have the key phrases so it comes up in a Google search. Otherwise, no one will ever find it. Jewish at the front doesn't mean anything. No one will ever find, everything is now determined by Google searches. Okay, then the German title is Elemente und Ursprünge totaler Herrschaft. Elements and origins of tyranny, or of tyranny. Herrschaft is hard to translate that, of master power. So it's not quite totalitarianism, it's a different phrase. And it's elements and origins, not just the elements of it. But she wrote it in English. She didn't write it in German. She wrote it in English. But again, the sentences are long and it's a stilted English, because it's English. She thinks in German, she writes in English, right? So that's how she's moving along. So with that introduction, I thought what I would do is we'll just go through, I just want to go through, I'm in the wrong book. I'm going to go through, and then when we get through the chapters that you have, but that's the second chapter, and I'll just want to share the key passages and just kind of unpack them, and just interrupt me at any point, any questions, if anything is not clear, and then we'll go through this. So part one is anti-Semitism, and then she starts with quotation by Roger Martin Dugard, a French thinker. This is her the opening. What's the word for when you open a chapter with a quotation? Epigraph. Yeah. This is a remarkable century which opened with the revolution and ended with the affair. That's the Dreyfus affair. Perhaps it will be called the century of rubbish. So, because it's basically about the 19th century, the first volume. Yeah. Someone defaced the portrait just now? Yes. Oh, wow. In the UK, Linda saying, I'm just repeating for those watching, that there was a defacement of the portrait of Dreyfus in the UK, part of an anti-Israel protest. Yeah, that's something. Oh, Balfour. Okay, that's Balfour. Yes. Well, that makes more sense. Right, because Balfour was the one who sets up the Jewish state, and it kind of starts the whole process where we are today. So that's a different story. This is Dreyfus. We're going to end with the Dreyfus affair in France, and that's like the end of the first theory, but the first stage. So her titles are very important. The inside titles are all hers. It's just the book title that she lost control over to the publishers. So the first title in the anti-Semitism section is Anti-Semitism as an Outrage to Common Sense. Okay, and then she's, I'll just start. Let's look at her first sentence. Many still consider it an accident that Nazi ideology centered around anti-Semitism, and that Nazi policy consistently and uncompromisingly aimed at the persecution and finally the extermination of the Jews. Right? And that's a very, very important point. She's writing so early, and it continues to be the case, right? That when historians are talking about the history of the Third Reich and the history of, the German war effort in World War II, they do not focus on anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. It's sort of like on the side. It's there, but it's not a central element of the story. And then we tend to do, Holocaust is a separate part of the story. And she's just saying you can't do that. You can't separate the two. It's essential to the Nazi rise to power and what they were interested in doing. When I teach history here in 7th grade in our Hebrew school, and I do 20th century history, the Holocaust in Israel, but I also go through the history of World War I, the Nazi rise to power, the history of World War II. You can't separate that from the history of the Holocaust. It's part and parcel of the same thing. We do it together. And she's saying that right here at the beginning. She says, only the horror of the final catastrophe, and even more, right, the Holocaust is not yet a common phrase yet. I mean, she's writing this less than a decade, about a decade after the end of the war. And even more, the homelessness and uprootedness of the survivors made the Jewish question so prominent in our everyday political life. What the Nazis themselves claimed to be their chief discovery, the role of the Jewish people in world politics, and their chief interest, the persecution of Jews all over the world, have been regarded by public opinion as a pretext for winning the masses or an interesting device of demagogy. Most people say, they're just doing that to win votes, taking advantage of prejudice, but it's not really essential to who they were. And she says, no, it is essential to who they are. It is an essential part of the story. And then she talks about that we tend to sort of dismiss anti-Semitism from the story and this is where she gets controversial. And this is where it's kind of between the lines in Origins of Totalitarianism, but it's an essential part of the argument. But it becomes clear in Eichmann in Jerusalem, and because Eichmann in Jerusalem was much more popularly read than Origins, which is why then, she wasn't quite prepared for the brunt of anger against her with the Eichmann book because she had all the theories she put here. And her idea, she said, it's not blaming the victims. It's not blaming the Jews, but looking at maybe we all were part of what was going on in Europe. And maybe the Jews should have had a different approach to politics. Right? We talked about that before in her critique of Zionism. We talked about it before in what she writes about Rachel Varnhagen. She said maybe the Jews should have been more active and maybe think, if we had to, and again, it's not blaming the victim, but it's saying that, and there's a fine difference. It's saying that if we had to do it again, maybe we would do it again differently. That's not blaming the victim. That's saying I don't like where things ended up. Nobody likes how things ended up, because obviously it didn't go well. So the question is, right, could there have been a different path that maybe, had we understood things differently, had we understood the patterns, both Jews and non-Jews, we could have got into a different result. And she poses that. I'm going to take the question 1 second. I just want to say what she phrased there. She says there is a common sense fallacy is that the Jews, because they were an entirely powerless group, caught up in the general and insoluble conflicts of the time, could be blamed for them and finally be made to appear the hidden authors of all evil. Now that, she says, is obviously a fallacy. You can't say the Jews are powerless and also blame them for what happened. But maybe there was, but we have to understand, what power did they, and when did they not have power, when did they have power? She says, the best illustration and the best refutation of this explanation, dear to the hearts of many liberals, is in a joke which was told after the First World War. And this is great. An anti-Semite claimed that the Jews had caused the war. The reply was, yes, the Jews and the bicyclists. Why the bicyclists? Asked the one. Why the Jews? Asked the other. Right? So it's just as ridiculous to blame the Jews as to blame the bicyclists. So that's the argument that the Jews had no role. But then she's going to go on to say that the theory that the Jews are always the scapegoat implies that the scapegoat might have been anyone else as well. Because it means the scapegoat is just picked as a scapegoat. And the story that she wants to tell is that the Jews had a particular role in European history, and that particular role made them more than just a random scapegoat. What she's arguing is that anti-Semitism is different from other prejudices, that it's a specific prejudice that is specific to Jews. There's a reason why Jews are hated more than other minorities. And by understanding the role of Jews in society as it develops in Europe in the 19th century, in the 18th and 19th century, leading up to World War II, we can understand why anti-Semitism developed and was so much more lethal than other forms of prejudice. So again, right, she's not blaming the Jews, but she's saying we're not just random victims. Right? There is something about the Jewish role in history. You can't go back. You can't do it again. But let's at least understand the patterns, which is why she cared about Zionism, even though she broke with the Zionist movement in 1948. Mina, you had a point there.
Do you believe that there is a parallel between that concept and what's going on in Gaza now? That Israel does not want to be seen as defenseless?
So the question is whether I see a parallel between this theory and what's going on with Gaza when Israel doesn't want to seem defenseless. I mean, there's an overall parallel just as the very existence of the state of Israel is the result of the Zionist movement, which is the idea that Jews should take power, right? That we shouldn't be passive, and we have a right to self-defense like any other people. So I don't think it's specific to the specific tactics in Gaza. I think just in general, just the existence of the state of Israel is a response to sort of the more passive approach of Jews in history in the pre-state period. So in that sense, I would agree, yeah. Okay, so I give you, she talks about the importance of, of understanding the facts of history and not just being driven by the ideology tends to take over from facts. There's another great essay of hers just on truth and politics, and it's so prescient today, given our current politics, and that we hear, realities that are just not always matchable with the facts, right? And she says, it's a great line here, for history itself is destroyed and its comprehensibility based upon the fact that it is enacted by men and therefore can be understood by men is in danger whenever facts are no longer held to be part and parcel of the past and present world and are misused to prove this or that opinion. So when you just misuse and abuse facts to argue an opinion, it not only affects the present and the future, it also affects the past because it blinds our understanding of history. For example, a certain former president likes to use the term the greatest X in history, the greatest X in American history. Everything is the superlative in history. Okay, so, and as an historian, it's not the most, there are plenty of other things that bother me too, not just that. But as a historian, I'm like, how do you make these superlative statements about history? That's what she's saying here. That when we use facts for a political argument, it even affects our understanding of the past as well. And that's what she's trying to do here. Chapter 2, it's called The Jews and the Nation State, the Birth of Anti-Semitism. So I try to go through, it's the chapter that you have in the book is chapter 3, The Jews and Society. But I'll go through here the main points. And then her subheadings kind of give you, as she builds the argument, the equivocalities of emancipation and the Jewish state banker. So she talks about the role of the Jews as bankers. She says that this idea that, the Jews have money, which is a classic anti-Semitic trope, she says, well, actually, the Jews were the bankers. Now, most Jews weren't bankers. Most Jews were poor. But the Jews did have a role in banking, which is sort of inherited from the medieval period where Christians couldn't lend to Christians at interest. Jews couldn't lend to Jews, but Jews could lend to Christians, and Jews were used as sources of capital. So she sort of, goes through that history and the role that the Jews, and then that leads into a section that she calls early anti-Semitism. So she writes, it is an obvious, if frequently forgotten rule, that anti-Jewish feeling acquires political relevance only when it can combine with a major political issue or when Jewish group interests come into open conflict with those of a major class in society. Okay, so that's a basic rule, right? That it's not just hatred of Jews. It's hatred of Jews when there's an issue in society that a certain class is upset about. Then the Jews will be blamed for that. Her overall theory is that the Jews, part of it is the role of banking and other roles that develop later, always ally themselves with the central government, the empire, right, with the powers that be. So whenever elements of society are upset about something in society, they will blame the Jews because it's easier to blame the Jews than to blame the central royal imperial authority, right? So, and there's that, so, and that's the, where it developed, right, the other way, that rather than become a part in a people like other peoples, the Jews were sort of like an anti-people, because instead they were just worked with the central government. Because I always thought that that would be in Jewish interests, but then it always backfired when there was an upswing, of local anger. Yeah. Right, when Jews are accused of being elitists and globalists. Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Craig. Right. Simultaneously bankers and Bolshevists, Jews, very flexible. Right. The whole boogeyman, yes. That's right. That's right, absolutely. So the Jews are criticized of being Bolshevists in outside communist countries, right? Inside communist countries and everywhere they're criticized of being bankers, but whatever, right? So it's very, very complicated, the different tropes that are used there. Yeah. The sons of the bankers do become leftist, right, and do move more into leftist politics. Yes, yeah. So she writes here that the anti-Semites coined new nationalist phrases like state within a state and nation within the nation for the Jews. And then she writes, certainly wrong in the first instance. They were never a state within a state, because the Jews had no political ambitions of their own and were merely the only social group that was unconditionally loyal to the state. They were half right in the second, a nation within a nation, because the Jews, taken as a social and not as a political body, actually did form a separate group within the nation. Right? So let me just unpack that a bit. It's that there's a difference between a nation and a state. Right? We talk about the rise of the nation state. Right? And that was what her issue was with Zionism, right? She says, I'm all for a Jewish nation, not so excited about a Jewish state. So the nation is just the people. It's an identity. A state is a political construct. The Jews were never a state within a state because they never had political power, because they never had political ambitions, she said, until the Zionist movement. But they are a nation, and not only did they have no political ambitions to be a state within a state, it's quite the opposite, because again, let me read that phrase again. They were the only social group that was unconditionally loyal to the state. The only ones. They were the most loyal to the state were the Jews, because the Jews always attached Arendt to the government. They saw themselves, and part of that is because of the emancipation, the idea we are loyal to the state. So the Jews are always loyal to the state, even more than to themselves, right? We're not interested in our own ambitions, and we're not loyal to any of the sub-segments of the state, right? So if you have different groups in the state, I'm not interested in that. I'm just loyal to the state. And that obviously worked against, because then when you don't like the state, then you identify the Jews with the state. That's what clearly happened, in Weimar Germany, as the Nazis rise to power, that the Jews are associated with the German Republic, which was the Weimar state, and that's so the Nazis were able to use that anti-Semitic approach because they really sought to undermine the state, right, and take over the state. So they did that by attacking the Jews, because the Jews were seen as identical with the state. Of course, the state was more than the Jews, but the Jews were probably more loyal to the constitutional structure of the republic than any other group itself, because the groups had their own identity. The Jews, their identity as Germans was purely to the German state. Yeah. Mark. Oh, and then Bob. Bob had his hand first. Bob. My book. Hannah Arendt's more important. Right. Well, yeah. Well, that was basically what I wrote. I mean, the Jews couldn't wait to enlist in the army, and it was like, and that's true across the board in the different countries, that the Jews went out of their way to demonstrate their patriotism to the countries where they served, and their identity was serving as national, so not serving as Jews, but just serving as Germans, as Americans. Whereas, for example, you could have Italian Americans who are serving as Italian Americans in the army in World War I. The Jews are serving as Americans, and that's what she's trying to say there. Mark. Mm-hmm.
He points out that it was Jews and Catholics that Hitler did not like because of dual loyalty. The Catholics loyal to the church as well as Germany.
Right, so you have the dual loyalty that's attached to both Catholics and to Jews. Dual loyalty is an issue for Jews after 1948. It's less of an issue before 1948, which was why the Jewish establishment in most Western countries was generally Zionist, until the state was established, when it was no longer politique to be anti-Jewish state. So, but that's for that issue of dual loyalty. But that happens later. That's not in the 19th century. Craig, and then Eddie, and then I want to move on. Yeah.
How meaningful it was to me when I was in Newport, Rhode Island.
Yeah.
Reading about George Washington's letter to Jewish people, reassuring them of their safety to worship. And I think that speaks to your point about Jews who have a history of oppression by the state, and they were assured by the state that when it was going to be okay, that's why they go in.
Yeah, what Craig is saying is that George Washington's famous letter to the Newport, Rhode Island community of guaranteeing their right to freedom is so, that's like a sacred document to the Jews, because this is the first president. So they attach to federalism, right? Because it was the federal state in this country that is guaranteeing the right to freedom of religion. So it's an example of that attachment to the center. Yeah, Ed. How dominant Goldman Sachs is what? I don't understand. Right. Why Goldman Sachs is dominant in banking? I'm not an economist. I don't know enough about that. I'm sorry. Yeah. The anti-Semites claim because it's a clearly Jewish name, so, okay. Yeah. Yeah. People continue, it's the same, we continue, right? The big Wall Street firms, all those are Jews. It's the same, it's an old story. And there are Jews involved, they're not all Jewish. They're not all Jewish, and most Jews are not Wall Street bankers. So, yeah. It's still there. It's still there. And that's what amazing after all these years is not enough has changed. Yeah. Yeah. Mina. Yeah.
Were you invited to speak at the Glen Rock?
No.
It was only a Glen Rock thing.
That was only a Glen Rock thing. My colleague spoke, the rabbi there. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Closed the meeting.
Yeah.
But it was interesting how many police were there
Yeah.
in anticipation that there could be a problem.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
how comforting it was
Yeah.
to have the mayor and the police chief
Yeah.
assure the citizens that they had.
Yeah, we're saying that there was a gathering last night in Glen Rock, against anti-Semitism, with a strong support and also concern from the police to make sure it stayed peaceful. So now we're in chapter 3, which is the chapter that you actually had in the book, so you could read it, or maybe did read it, which is called The Jews and Society. Oh, before I do that, let me just say one more thing about this idea of Jews being most loyal to the center. So the way we see that is the choice of languages, that in the Jews, the language, when you had multi-ethnic states, the Jews used the general rules. The Jews always used the language of the empire, the most cosmopolitan language. They didn't use an internal language. Yes, Jews might speak Yiddish amongst themselves, but Jews would always speak the language of the central state. So, for example, Franz Kafka, he's sometimes even referred to as a German Jewish writer. Kafka was Czech, right? He lived in Prague. But as a young Jewish man, it would never have occurred to him to write in Czech. Right? There were plenty of other people writing in Czech, but he would only write in German because he was Jewish. Right? And not that there were other non-Jewish Jews who wrote in German. I mean, the Czech lands were a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but the Jews who lived in Prague used German. The Jews who lived in Budapest used German, not Magyar, when they wrote. Right? And that was sort of the standard there. The Jews who lived in the Polish parts of the Russian Empire used Russian, not Polish. And the German parts used German, not Polish. The Galicia, which was the Austrian part, would use German, that they would learn, and this was an educational decision, that the language that they learned to read and write in their general education was the imperial language. Jews throughout the Soviet Union used Russian. So I'll tell you just a personal story. So my wife Alla was born in Odessa, now Odessa is a cosmopolitan city where Russian is used, but now it's bilingual with Russian and Ukrainian. Same thing would be true of Kiev, whereas if you go into the countryside, it's more only Ukrainian. It's like if you go to Quebec, in Montreal, you'll hear English and French. If you go into the countryside, you'll only hear French. So it's always been that way because it's still a French-speaking area, but the cities are more cosmopolitan until you get nationalist politics come into play. So when there's an upswing in the Quebecois independence movement, then people will be careful not to use English too much if they can avoid it in Montreal, right? And in Ukraine, there is obviously a very strong swing against Russian to use only Ukrainian. So we just last night went out to dinner. We've heard of a restaurant that opened in Nyack called A Taste of Ukraine or something. It's a Ukrainian restaurant. It's a brand new restaurant. I thought we should go there and check it out. And it's all with Ukrainian signs, and the waiters and waitresses are in Ukrainian traditional costumes, all Ukrainian dishes. There's like 12 different types of Ukrainian beer, and everything, is very, very authentic. So but one of the rules, they refuse to speak any Russian. And and usually, and Alice for Russian, and they say, "Oh no, we don't." Of course, they speak Russian. They just refuse to speak it in the restaurant. So there was this very interesting conversation where and they try to speak Ukrainian. Now, Ala was born in Ukraine. She can understand just a few words, but she doesn't. When she grew up, especially in a Jewish family, she only spoke Russian, so she doesn't know Ukrainian. And so there was one thing where the owner is trying to speak. And the owner is trying to think of a word in English, and she can't think of the word. So then she very quietly switches to Russian with Allah. And start talking Russian. It was like very, very quiet. She switches back after she said, "Oh no, we don't speak Russian." So there's just the politics over languages between the local nationalism and the sort of, now obviously Ukraine is not a part of Russia now. Hopefully it will not become a part of Russia. So where Ukraine will continue to increase. You see that, for example, in Barcelona, which is completely bilingual between Spanish and Catalan. If you go in the countryside, it's only Catalan. No one will speak, But if there's a referendum on for the trying to go for, independence for Catalonia, then all of a sudden people are afraid to speak Spanish. But that's the Jews of. So the point is, and this is what she says, for better or worse. In this case, it was worse. The Jews kind of tagged on to the state because they were the most loyal. That's what made them the most at risk, the most vulnerable when people are turning against the central state. That was the case. Part of that was in the Russian Revolution. The Jews would be associated with the Tsarist regime. Even the Tsarist regime was the most anti-Semitic regime in the world at that point, right? Because the Jews always tried to appeal the government favor. So, I mean, go through this chapter. You have, she says, yes. Yeah. Yes, you're mentioning in Canada. That's true in America also. Across the Jewish world, that if you're interested in that, read my book. The whole Jewish people throughout the world were all on the German side in World War I because Russia was the enemy of the Jews and the Germans were fighting the Russians. And I write about Jewish soldiers in the German army who basically liberating the Jews from Russian oppression. It only changes in this country when the U.S. joins the war. Then you got to be a good American. Obviously, you're not going to go against the United States. But before that, the Jewish establishment everywhere supported the Central Powers in World War I. Absolutely, yeah. Okay, so the first section of this Jews in Society part you have is called Between Pariah and Parvenu, which are the terms that she uses in the Rachel Varnhagen book, right? And it comes into here in her discussion of theory. And I'll read you a few passages. Assimilation, in the sense of acceptance by non-Jewish society, was granted them, the Jews, only as long as they were clearly distinguished exceptions from the Jewish masses. Right? You only were granted granted equality if you were an exception. You're like, oh, I'm Jewish, but I'm a European. I'm not like the traditional Jews. I'm not like the regular Jews. I've made it. So making it is assimilating, right? Exceptional. And so her first point is that you're not, this was her critique, which she has in the Rachel Varnhagen book, and she does it here, that even in the post-emancipation period, the Jews were never accepted as Jews. And the Jewish path to acceptance was leaving Judaism behind rather than trying to get acceptance as Jews. And that's what she calls a parvenu as opposed to a pariah. But in order to be a parvenu in society, you had to be a pariah from the Jewish people, right? You had to be an exceptional Jew, and in order to be a normal American, an exceptional Jew who, loves shrimp cocktail. I don't know. Yes.
How does this tie in with the historical anti-Semitism of Jews as Christ killers?
The question was, how does this tie into the exceptional anti-Semitism of Jews as Christ killers? She's really not that interested in the theological background. There's a few sections where she talks about it, but she's interested in the developments in more modern European history. That doesn't play a big role in her thinking. But that's another argument why anti-Semitism is a specific type of prejudice, because there is this deep-rooted animus against Jews that you have through the medieval period. That argument is then that continues to develop into modern anti-Semitism. And that is another explanation. Her explanation is not the only one, but it doesn't play a role in her analysis. Her analysis is more, you think it's because the Jews are bankers? Well, yeah, it is kind of because the Jews are bankers. It is kind of because the Jews serve the state. So she tries to take the reality that she's hearing in the argument. Not that there weren't Nazis. Stoker was the Nazi anti-Semite, was the preacher. He used the Christ killer thing all the time. She just didn't see that as influential as the political, economic issue. She's taking a real secular analysis, is how she's looking at it. Yeah. Ultimately, it's a matter of blood, which we'll get to eventually. Yeah, we'll get to that. So whenever those who actually tried to improve Jewish conditions attempted to think of the Jewish question from the point of view of the Jews themselves, that is, well-meaning non-Jews, they immediately approached it merely in its social aspect. It has been one of the most unfortunate facts in the history of the Jewish people that only its enemies and almost never its friends understood that the Jewish question was a political one. Right? So that's her argument against David. You're saying, what about the theological stuff? She says it was a political issue, but the anti-Semites were the only ones who really understood that. And it's very, very telling there. Okay, so she refers specifically to Rachel Varnhagen and kind of, and talks about her in this chapter. And And then she talks about Jewish notables wanted to dominate the Jewish people and therefore had no desire to leave it, right? They didn't want to assimilate because the nobles, the powerful bankers, I mean, they had power, the Jews, because they were the ones who were able to enter the royal courts and, wield power there and then use that power in becoming the elites among the Jews. While it was characteristic of Jewish intellectuals that they wanted to leave their people and be admitted to society. They both shared the feeling that they were exceptions. So both share the feeling that they were exceptions. They were unique among the Jews. The intellectuals wanted to be accepted as just European intellectuals. The bankers wanted to be accepted in courts and then go back and lord it over the Jews. Jewish intellectuals knew they were never going to have political power even among the Jews, so they looked for influence in what's called the Republic of Letters, in general writing and society. Here's another great sentence. To rationalize an ambiguity which they themselves did not fully understand, they might pretend to be a man in the street and a Jew at home. Right, so that was a term that was always being. I'm a man in the street, right? And at home I'm Jewish. At home I pass through the threshold. There's the mezuzah. Then I could put my kippah on. I can start speaking Yiddish. I can daven. When I go out, I'm just German. And she said it's rationalizing the ambiguity. This actually amounted to a feeling of being different from other men in the street because they were Jews, and different from other Jews at home because they were not like ordinary Jews. So it ended up differentiating you from everyone. Here, to a certain extent, every Jew in every generation had somehow at some time to decide whether he would remain a pariah and stay out of society altogether, or become a parvenu, or conform to society on the demoralizing condition that he not so much hide his origin as betray the secret of his origin, the secret of his people as well. Right? So you either remain a pariah in society by being embracing your Jewish identity, or you leave that identity and try to be just someone without Jewish identity, which is demoralizing ultimately and emasculating, right? Takes away that sense of power that one would normally strive for in the normal political context. The Jews felt simultaneously the pariah's regret at not having become a parvenu and the parvenu's bad conscience at having betrayed his people and exchanged equal rights for personal privileges. And that's her point, that the Jew who assimilates and to get equal rights is not getting equal rights. It's just getting personal privileges. Equal rights would have been to be accepted as a Jew. It's not equal if you have to pretend to not be Jewish and just be parv, which is parvenu, right? Not converting to Christianity, just being a citizen of no particular identity, right? A Jew, that person's Jewish, but there's nothing in anything, and the person is trying so hard to not say or sound or act Jewish. And that's a Jewish thing to do. Politically, yes. Yeah, she brings that up all the time. Absolutely, she does. Yeah, she has a long section here about Disraeli, the Benjamin Disraeli, who was the British politician of Jewish origins, and then I'll read you one section she hears here about bankers. The sons of Jewish millionaires inclined toward leftist movements, right? You said that, right. Precisely because their banker fathers had never come into an open class conflict with workers. So then that's the next generation is the intellectuals, then a protest against their fathers. They therefore completely lacked that class consciousness that the son of any ordinary bourgeois family would have had as a matter of course. While on the other side, and for exactly the same reason, the workers did not harbor those open or hidden anti-Semitic sentiments which every other class showed the Jews as a matter of course. Obviously, leftist movements in most countries offered the only true possibilities for assimilation. Right? That it was only in labor politics that the Jews were able to really be accepted who they were, because that Jews from the working class or intellectuals who identified with the working class could be fully accepted there. Right? So the greatest example is Trotsky, although ultimately, like everyone else in Stalin's circle, fell out of favor. But the interesting point there is that there was no development of even a Jewish bourgeois class because the children of the bankers didn't want to be bankers and rebelled against it because they saw that as denial. So it's just, her point is just another example of the Jews did not form a normal development of a segment of society in her analysis of the Jews and society. Let me see if I have something here I want to share. Yeah, so this is in the next section called Between Vice and Crime. Never did the fact of Jewish birth play such a decisive role in private life and everyday existence as among the assimilated Jews. Right? The fact of, and this is the irony, because they're so concerned with hiding their Jewish birth, is how Jewish birth plays such an important role, because they're obsessed with it not playing a role. Right? So it's always there, behind the scenes there, among the assimilated Jews. The Jewish reformer who changed a national religion into a religious denomination, we're talking about Reform Judaism here, with the understanding that religion is a private affair. The Jewish revolutionary, that's a leftist intellectual, who pretended to be a world citizen in order to rid himself of Jewish nationality. The educated Jew, that's one who is a man in the street and a Jew at home, sort of an educated bourgeois Jew. She's criticizing all of those forms. Right? Each one of these succeeded in converting a national quality into a private affair. The result was that their private lives, their decisions and sentiments became the very center of their Jewishness. And the more the fact of Jewish birth lost its religious, national, and social economic significance, the more obsessive Jewishness became. Right? That's right? And Jews were obsessed by it as one may be by a physical defect or advantage, and addicted to it as one may be to a vice. Right? That it just was obsessed about their struggle with that Jewish background, right? And moving beyond it. So it's even though they're trying to move beyond it, it's the pole of Jewishness that's defining it that they're obsessed with, even as they're trying to overcome it. And that's a central theme of the Rachel Varnhagen biography, which here she's theorizing, putting the theoretical structure, what she tells there in biographical form. Here. Oh, yeah. All right, let me see if I want to finish the anti-Semitism. I'll give you just a few more passages. Jews had been able to escape from Judaism into conversion, but from Jewishness, there was no escape. Right? Conversion, you could escape from Judaism, but not from Jewishness. And a crime, moreover, and she talks about the difference between a crime and a vice, and she said the Jewish origin was a vice for Jews who were trying to assimilate. A crime is met with punishment. A vice can only be exterminated. And she's always hinting at the darkness that comes, right? If it's just crimes the Jews are doing, then you can always punish criminals. But you can't punish a vice. The vice has to be wiped out. And that's what leads the line towards extermination, towards the final solution. So she sets but again, she's not blaming the Jews for doing that, but she's explaining the structure that when you have the Jews formed a segment of society that understood their own essence as a vice, this general assimilated Jewry, which she's criticizing, right? She criticizes that, Rachel Varnhagen, that her whole life she was trying to assimilate when she should have embraced her Judaism, which she only does at the end of her life. Hannah Arendt herself, with her strong Zionist identity. So that's between the lines, that she's saying when you try to assimilate and then you see your own Jewishness as a vice, then don't be surprised, but that's the structure. So why do you think the Jews are singled out for extermination? Because everyone else understood that Jewishness was just seen as a vice, and that's what you do with a vice. The Nazis didn't invent it, it developed. There's a line towards that. Again, she's not blaming the Jews, but she's saying that these are how things developed and the problem with the development. Social factors unaccounted for in political and economic history, hidden under the surface of events, never perceived by the historian, and let me skip that part, sorry. Okay, I have to see what else I want to share. So the last chapter here is on the Dreyfus affair, and she makes a point here, also a biting point. The wrong done to a single Jewish officer in France. Dreyfus was a Jewish captain in the French army who's accused of espionage for Germany. Okay, why? Again, Marcus, what you said. Because Jews were always accused of being pro-German, because Germany was where most Jews lived, and Germany was the antagonist of Russia. France is sort of aligned with Russia to balance German power. So that's why in France, the anti-Semites would accuse a Jew of being pro-German. So that's the line there. So the wrong done to a single Jewish officer in France was able to draw from the rest of the world a more vehement and united reaction than all the persecutions of German Jews a generation later. That's a bite at Western society there. You made such a big deal about Dreyfus, but no one spoke up for the Jews of Germany only a few decades later, right? And then talks about why, because the Dreyfus affair was not just about anti-Semitism. It was a struggle over the nature of the French Revolution, the French Republic, the old regime coming back, and it was of which the anti-Semitism just played a role in. So she kind of, let's see. Here, I'll read you this section, which goes into her basic theory of the alliance of the Jews with the state, like Dreyfus, who was a patriotic Frenchman. The political influence and the social status of the Jews had for centuries been due to the fact that they were a closed group who worked directly for the state and were directly protected by it on account of their special services. Their close and immediate connection with the machinery of government was possible only so long as the state remained at a distance from the people, while the ruling classes continued to be indifferent to its management. In such circumstances, the Jews were, from the state's point of view, the most dependable element in society just because they did not really belong to it. That's why the Jews, so the state liked the fact the Jews were loyal because the state knew the Jews were the best to depend on because they had no other identity and loyalty. They were solely loyal to the state. That only works so long as the state is not dependent on the population. Right? But then when you have the development of the nation state of populist politics, that's why most populist politics are dangerous for Jews, right? Because Jews are never included. The populace in any country, not just in this country, is always going to turn anti-Semitic because the Jews are always separate from the population, the identity. In such circumstances, the parliamentary system allowed the liberal bourgeoisie to gain control of the state machine. To this bourgeoisie, however, the Jews had never belonged, and they therefore regarded it with a not unwarranted suspicion. So the Jewish approach worked when states were controlled by princes. But when they were controlled by parliaments, and the parliaments are controlled by the majority parties never reflected the Jews, even though the Jews tried to join and be a part of them. Even in Germany, right, the liberal parties were always minority. Right? The parties that had the most votes were the ones that represented local interests or populist interests, like the Nazi Party. Sub-interests, like the Center Party. There was a party that represented the Catholics. The Jews, even if they made their own party, there were never enough people for it to get elected or make a difference. Yeah. She has a lot of footnotes. There are a lot of footnotes. Yeah. Yeah, she has a lot of footnotes. She documents it. They're all, yeah. Yeah, in here, there are endnotes. If you read it in you look at the end of the chapter, the footnotes are there. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, she doesn't document everything, but she gives you some footnotes, yeah. It's the same thing, right? Because one of the reasons, it's not just because they're leftists. The Jews generally identify with the Democratic Party because the Democratic Party has generally been, okay, we're talking like after the Civil War, right? Democratic Party is the pro-state party, right? Where the Republican Party is against big government. Democratic Party is for big government. Jews always support big government. That's just not that, again, that's innate, right? We always see, because it's that big, strong federal government that's going to be the most protective of our rights. So that's just that natural thing. So it follows the same pattern, absolutely. And that's why it switches, right? Because up to the Civil War, the Democratic Party was the anti-union party, but then it changes. So the Jews will like the union. They will always support the union. except if they're in the South. So then it also gets complicated. The Jews could remain a separate group outside of society only so long as a more or less homogeneous and stable state machine had a use for them and was interested in protecting them. The decay of the state machine brought about the dissolution of the closed ranks of Jewry, which had so long been bound up with it. So that's where, when that strong state starts to decay, and that's what the Dreyfus trial is, it's a decaying of the Third Republic, right? That's when that opens the door for anti-Semitism. The rise of Nazism is the decay of the Weimar Republic. So that's what opens the door towards anti-Semitism, when that strong state starts to lose its power. And then she talks about here just a few things about the mob. The mob is primarily a group in which the residue of all classes are represented. This makes it so easy to mistake the mob for the people, which also comprises all strata of society. While the people in all great revolutions fight for true representation, the mob will shout for the strong man, the great leader. For the mob hates society from which it is excluded, as well as parliament where it is not represented. That goes into what I was saying last week, why she says it's the problem with going towards a problem with unanimity in politics. That you say, oh, this is the unanimous view of the people, but you're excluding others. So the mob is saying it's not representing everyone. The mob is not the people. The mob is a populist movement that's following a great leader that feels a sense that we have been excluded from power, from parliament, from the state machine. And that rise of that mob is what's going to weaken the central state, which the Jews were always aligned with, and that's why it opens the door towards anti-Semitism. She's not writing about our politics today. This is old, but she's writing a structure that you can apply, and that should be clear. Here. There can be no doubt that in the eyes of the mob, the Jews came to serve as an object lesson for all the things they detested. If they hated society, they could point to the way in which the Jews were tolerated within it. And if they hated the government, they could point to the way in which the Jews had been protected by or were identifiable with the state. While it is a mistake to assume that the mob preys only on Jews, the Jews must be accorded first place among its favorite victims. That's her theory there. That's where she's growing to this whole section on anti-Semitism, right? When the mob turns against the state, when it criticizes the state, it criticizes the Jews, because the Jews are the most loyal to the state. And that was the error in Jewish politics, that we, the Jews, thought, oh, we don't want to do our own politics, we want to be accepted, we're going to be loyal to the state. But then when you have the rise of mob populist politics, then we're on the outside more than ever before. It was the philosophy of pessimism and the mob's delight in doom, right? That everything is bad, everything is the worst ever, that was the first sign of the imminent collapse of the European intelligentsia, as that's starting then at the end of the 19th century. And then I'll do the last sentence when she finishes her discussion of the Dreyfus trial, and then I got to run upstairs. My students have been waiting for me for 10 minutes. Thus closes the only episode, the Dreyfus trial, in which the subterranean forces of the 19th century enter the full light of recorded history. Like she says, the ugliness of the anti-Semitism, it wasn't a blip in a beautiful 19th century. It was subterranean. It was there all the time. And only in the Dreyfus trial do we see it peak forth, but that's growing and growing, and then ruins society, of course, in the 20th century. The only visible result was that it gave birth to the Zionist movement. The only political answer Jews have ever found to anti-Semitism, and the only ideology in which they have ever taken seriously a hostility that would place them in the center of world events. And that's how she ends the first volume about Zionism. That's the only political answer the Jews have ever had to anti-Semitism. It's extraordinary. She writes that given how critical she was of the Zionist movement and Zionist politics, but the idea of Zionism was so important for her for that reason. We got a whole month. So again, if you want to read something for next time I'm going to do section 2, which is on imperialism, and that is the one called Expansion, but I think also the Perplexity of the Right of Man, I think, is from volume 2. So you can read those sections, and I'm sure I'll see you before then, but that is about a month from now. Thank you.